When two of the most powerful pastors in America found themselves on opposite sides of a message shaking the church, people knew something big was coming. The names alone carried weight: Bishop T.D. Jakes and Pastor Creflo Dollar. These were not ordinary preachers. These were men who had built empires of faith, reached millions of souls, and stood on stages where every word mattered. You won't believe how fast this story turned from a quiet Sunday service into a storm that had everyone talking. For years, they had shared the same space in ministry, not close friends, not enemies, but powerful voices moving in their own lanes. That balance broke when Pastor Creflo Dollar stood before his congregation and preached a sermon that many believe was aimed directly at Bishop Jakes. It started as a normal message on God's blessings, the kind Creflo was known for. But about halfway through, his tone changed. He began speaking about how some preachers had moved away from teaching prosperity, saying that it was wrong to separate faith from God's provision. Then came the line that set the internet on fire: "I don't care how big their church is or how many TV shows they have. That opinion is wrong." Let me tell you, anyone who had been following church news knew those words sounded a lot like they were meant for Bishop Jakes. This is how the quiet tension between them started boiling in public. Creflo went further, saying that the culture had shamed some preachers into changing their message, and that they had given up on teaching prosperity just to stay popular. The clip spread online in hours. Twitter threads popped up. TikTok videos replayed the moment again and again. Some people called Creflo brave for defending what they saw as biblical truth. Others called him divisive, accusing him of throwing personal shade instead of focusing on scripture. But here's the shocking part. He never mentioned Jakes by name, yet the connection was too obvious to ignore. The craziest part was how this single sermon pushed years of quiet differences right into the public spotlight. For years, Bishop Jakes had been known for a balanced message that included prosperity, but also focused heavily on emotional healing, social change, and spiritual growth. He had been moving further away from preaching about material blessings as the main focus, and to some, this was exactly what Creflo was challenging. And this is where it gets interesting because while the internet exploded with debates, Bishop Jakes remained silent. Day after day passed with no public comment. People wondered if he was ignoring the jab, planning a powerful response, or simply refusing to dignify it. But behind that silence, tension was building. Supporters of both sides were already drawing lines. The prosperity gospel debate, which had been simmering for years, was now in full view for the world to see. Social media was buzzing, and church circles were whispering. Everyone was waiting for Jakes to speak, not knowing that when he finally did, his words would hit harder than anyone expected. Sunday morning finally came, and with it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Bishop T.D. Jakes stepped onto the pulpit at the Potter's house in Dallas, just like he had done countless times before. But this time, the air felt different. The sanctuary was full. The online viewers were in the millions, and there was an unspoken question in every mind. Would he finally address the storm brewing around his name? His sermon began like any other, filled with scripture, heartfelt stories, and that familiar rhythm that kept people leaning in. But halfway through, his voice lowered, his eyes narrowed slightly, and the tone shifted. Then came the words that froze the room. "Let me tell you something. Don't twist my words." It was short, but the weight behind it was undeniable. He went on to say that he respected other ministers and understood that different preachers emphasized different parts of the gospel. But what he could not allow was for someone to misrepresent what he truly believed. He reminded the congregation that he had spent decades preaching the full counsel of God: salvation, grace, mercy, and yes, God's blessings too. But he refused to be boxed into just one message. If people thought he had rejected God's provision, they were not listening to him. They were listening to someone's spin. This was how he drew his line without ever speaking Creflo Dollar's name. But here is the shocking part. His delivery wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, slow, and precise, like every word had been chosen hours before he even stepped on stage. The room was silent, the congregation hanging on to every syllable. His tone carried no rage, but it had a sharpness that couldn't be missed, a mix of authority and disappointment. Those who knew Jakes' style could tell this was a calculated move. He wasn't just answering his critics, he was protecting his legacy. This is where it gets interesting, okay? Because the moment the clip hit social media, it went viral within hours. On TikTok, the phrase, "Don't twist my words," became a trending sound. Instagram Reels replayed his calm but cutting delivery again and again. Some praised him for showing maturity and not turning the pulpit into a battleground. Others accused him of throwing holy shade, saying he had called Creflo out without ever saying his name. The craziest part was how his quiet approach seemed to make the message louder. It gave his supporters something to rally behind, while also keeping the debate alive in a way that fueled even more speculation. This was not just a sermon anymore. It had become a chess move in a public theological game between two of the biggest names in ministry. After Bishop Jakes' words spread like wildfire, the church world seemed to split into two passionate camps. Supporters of Creflo Dollar praised him for being bold enough to defend prosperity teaching without backing down. They said he was standing for biblical truth in a culture that was trying to water it down. Many quoted his sermon online, repeating his message that faith in God's provision could never be separated. On the other side, Bishop Jakes' followers admired how he handled the situation with grace, refusing to get pulled into a shouting match. They saw him as the voice of balance, the one willing to look beyond wealth and talk about deeper transformation, healing the soul, uplifting the broken, and addressing real-life struggles. But here is the shocking part. The debate was no longer just about these two men. It had become a public argument about the direction of modern Christianity in America. Pastors, theologians, and even Christian talk shows started weighing in, dissecting every word both men had said. Some believed this was a healthy conversation that could push the church toward a better understanding of prosperity and spiritual priorities. Others feared it was a dangerous divide, one that could cause confusion among believers and give the wrong impression to those outside the faith. And this is where it gets interesting, because while the public was arguing, something else was happening behind the scenes. Insiders claimed that private talks were already underway. Trusted friends and ministry advisors from both sides were reportedly working to calm the waters, arranging conversations between Jakes and Dollar to keep the disagreement from growing into a permanent rift. The craziest part was how little the public knew about these quiet efforts. Online, it looked like a feud spiraling out of control. But behind closed doors, there were attempts to find common ground to protect not just reputations, but also the unity of the church. Yet, the tension was far from over because both sides still held to their core beliefs, and neither man seemed ready to shift his position. As the days went by, the story refused to die down. Social media kept it alive with fresh debates, new memes, and endless reaction videos. News outlets that normally ignored church matters began covering it, framing it as a clash of ideologies between two of the most influential pastors in America. You won't believe how far the conversation spread, from church pews to coffee shops, from Bible study groups to secular podcasts that rarely touch religious topics. People were no longer just discussing what Jakes and Dollar had said. They were questioning the very heart of prosperity teaching, asking whether the church was focusing more on material gain than on spiritual transformation. What makes this story different? It wasn't just about disagreement over scripture. It was about influence, legacy, and the power of public opinion. The craziest part was how this one moment exposed deeper cracks in the modern church, cracks that had been there for years but were now impossible to ignore. Younger believers watched closely, some feeling inspired by the boldness of the debate, others feeling uneasy about the lack of visible unity. Longtime church members were torn between loyalty to their pastor and the uncomfortable truth that their leaders didn't see eye to eye on such a fundamental issue. Destiny took an unexpected turn when these two titans of the pulpit spoke out, because now their words would be remembered long after the news cycle ended. No one could say for sure if their private talks would bring true reconciliation or if this was the beginning of a lasting divide. But one thing was certain: the impact had already been felt across the Christian world. This wasn't just a moment. It was a reminder that when leaders of great influence speak, their voices don't just echo in their own churches, they shape the conversations of an entire generation. And as the dust settled, one question lingered in every mind. Was this a fight that would heal the church, or a wound it would carry for years to come?